Chapter 6, The Shaping of a Nation. Part 2, Indian versus Anglo Land Rights. The English-American understanding of land ownership. Land, Indian land, had long been a big part of America's sense of personal salvation. Americans understood that God saved the soul, but they also understood that land saved the body. From the very moment that the Americans landed on the Atlantic or eastern shores of North America, they had developed a very strong interest in the land, the low mountains and dark forests that lay just to the west of them. The Indians who lived in that land were not numerous, and thus the land seemed almost empty, just waiting for the English colonists to come and settle there. At first, the English settlers and the Indian hunters attempted to stay on friendly terms with each other. But their concepts of land ownership were so different that conflict, bloody conflict, was inevitable. To the English, land ownership was demonstrated in the person's working of that land. Whoever cleared the land, cut back the forest, and planted crops in these new clearings could claim unchallenged title to the land. Idle land, land that was not farmed or grazed, was not owned by anyone. To the English, unfarmed land was uninhabited land. Thus the Indians, as hunters requiring the woodlands for the survival of the game they hunted, just did not factor into the English understanding of things. To the English way of thinking, Indian land was simply there waiting for the taking by some industrious individual. But according to the Indian way of thinking, the English were no more than thieves, stealing their land. In this contest for the land, Indians were technologically, numerically, and socially greatly outmatched. Not only did the English settlers possess superior weapons, they also had more highly disciplined or unified social powers. The Indians were not only small in number on the land, they were highly divided among themselves, ancient enemies, one small tribe against another. The Indians thus were tremendously handicapped in their efforts to hold back English expansion into their ancestral territories. Consequently, the expansion of land-hungry English, and later their American offspring, was rapid. There had been efforts from time to time, even from the beginning of the earliest English settlements, to legalize or regularize this question of land ownership. For the English, this was done through written legal assignments of the land in the form of deeds. Such legal assignments not only awarded ownership to an individual, but also to that individual in the rights of sale of that land to another, as a grant, often in marriage, often as the terms of peace after a war, or as a sale. Treaties as a follow-up to a war very often included the idea of the transfer of land from one individual, a king, for instance, to another. The weight or worth of treaties. Indians were aware of such arrangements, entering into arrangements themselves, similar to the European concept of a treaty. Thus, on many occasions, the English and tribal chiefs transacted land deals, that is, entered into treaties with one another. The Dutch thus purchased the island of Manhattan for their New Amsterdam, and Roger Williams so also purchased from the local tribes the land at the head of the Narragansett Bay for his Providence colony. But in general, even this nicety was ignored by the English, who pushed into Indian lands to make way for their own settlements, unaware of or ignoring the Indians' land rights. There often were treaties signed between the English and the Indians, usually following another bitter conflict or local land war, treaties usually simply acknowledging the loss of the lands by the Indians, though frequently accompanied by some comforting section which recognized the rights of the same Indians to other, uncontested territory. But treaties back in Europe among kings had very little longevity, quickly broken by their kings at the earliest opportunity. And so it was with the treaties the English signed with the Indians. These agreements were treated with the same lack of sense of anything permanent about them. This the Indians did not understand, for their idea of a treaty was that it formed a perpetual or permanent right to land use, one that would be handed down as a matter of honor by generation after generation. Sadly, the Indians were to learn that things did not work this way with the English. Besides, frontiersmen paid little attention to the land arrangements entered into with the Indians by their colonial governments. Such governments were far away, and the local frontiersmen living in a world far removed from the hills of the colonial governments, from the halls of the colonial governments, frontiersmen conducted their own affairs pretty much as they saw fit, regardless of what the colonial authorities had agreed to. The Christian understanding of all of this. Why didn't Christianity soften this kind of hard-handed land seizure? Christians, after all, were instructed by Jesus to love their neighbor as themselves. But their Bible also told them of the command of God to the Israelites to enter the land of the Canaanites and clear it of both the people and even the herds and flocks of the Canaanites. This was a necessary precondition for God to be able to settle the promised land with his chosen people. Of the two viewpoints, Christ-like love or Israelite aggression, when it came to dealing with the Indians, the tendency of Christian America was to take the Old Testament approach. Christian Americans generally saw themselves under the same instructions by God to clear the land, to make way for the people of God. The huge demographic or population pressures behind this expansion. Anyway, whatever the legal or moral points involved in this takeover of the land, there was little likelihood that the Indians were going to be able to hold back the flood of Europeans into their tribal territories. Since the late 1300s, the European population had exploded, and land hunger in Europe was very intense. This was the case not just in England, but in the Netherlands and in German-speaking Central Europe. The English first attempted in the 1500s to put excess population in Ireland, this being justified in the English mind by the primitiveness of Irish society. In the same way, English land settlement would soon be justified in America. But this Irish land soon filled up with settlers from Scotland, the so-called Scots-Irish, who in turn, by the early 1700s, would push on to America and become major settlers along the American Indian borderlands or frontiers. Even by the time of the American independence, numerous European settlers in America had left the coastal lowlands along the Atlantic coast and were settling the uninhabited areas of the Appalachian Mountains to the west. Some had even crossed these mountains and had begun to settle in the rolling hills of Kentucky and Tennessee to the west of the mountains. Indeed, one of the last tasks of the Continental Congress in 1787 was to design an orderly system of settlement of the land in the Northwest Territory, awarded the Americans in their peace settlement that ended the War of Independence with the English. Swift action was required to get settlers into these territories before the English found some new cause to break the peace treaty with the Americans and seize these lands again. Of course, the Indians were not consulted in this matter. They, as savages, counted not at all in the plans to map out a program of systematic land development in the West. And now that the legal reach of Anglo-America extended even to the Rockies, and possibly beyond, life was going to become very tough for the American Indian.